I do not.
Scanning, but can we have our cards on the chairs, and we have our voice gets better as you move up.
Oh, you got it? Thank you, sir.
We have few giveaways on the deal. The closer you get. Do you have a hard copy? Thank you, sir. Welcome, welcome. Thanks for coming. We have ours on there. If you give away, you get better as you move up to the top of the class.
I've been with them now for 11 years too. Wow. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Oh, more candy.
Welcome, ladies. How's it going? You'll have to have a business card on you. We're old school. We're not for our purposes, we're collecting cards.
I found a new addition to our team. So I
Okay.
have a law firm. But she's got
Thank you so much.
You betcha.
So we're partnering with
Excuse me?
Wonderful. Thank you. That's perfect. Thanks. Appreciate it. Welcome.
Hey, I know, I'm like here, doing shoulder bump. I'm trying to rep our industry game. I did it the wrong way. Thank you very much.
That's funny. Huh?
Did we talk to you already?
Yeah, you did. So we need some jelly beans, right?
Right, I saw you. Yeah. Oh,
Yeah. Three, Mr. Roddy.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carl Gibo. We are going to be starting the session on limitations on subcontracting. So if you're here for some other learning session, you might be in the wrong place. If you're here for some other lesser learning session, you are in the wrong place. Good seats are still available in the front row. You will notice that there are candies. Those candies are actually from England, by the way. I know they look like Mike's and Ike's. They're actually from London. And for those in the first 4 rows, those pens actually include highlighters. Those in the further rows, they're just pens. Okay. There's still, apparently there are folks who are still making their way through the maze out there to try to find this hideaway. And we'll give them a couple more minutes before we get started. I understand there's another session after this one in this room. We are located at booth 1213 in the exhibit hall, so if there are any questions that we can't get to during the session, please join us down there. We're also located right next to one of the bars. So just get in line, we can answer your questions, and I guarantee you with each drink, our answers get much more brilliant.
He's a comedian, it's Second Life.
Okay. All right, folks, welcome. Again, my name is Carl Gibo. I am the founder and president of the Government Contractors Assistance and Resource Line. And with me are Lanisha Gilmore. She's the managing member of the Gilmore firm. And Rod Hagan, who is with Lockheed Martin. He's a project manager out of Cape Canaveral, Florida. But Rod's had a very long and illustrious life in government contracting. He worked with WOSB and SDVOSB small business companies in government contracting for a number of years. He is an engineer by training and trade and been involved with a number of federal government construction projects. And he will be our first substantive speaker. But it is my chore to walk you through some of the other administrivia I'm sure you've seen at these other presentations. So first of all, I have to ask you to silence your cell phones. I have mine with me, but I am keeping track of the time. So I'm not making dinner reservations or other things of such nature. I'm keeping us on schedule. Also, I want to thank any sponsors here. Thank you very much. You make the SAME convention here possible. We appreciate your contributions. Anyone who's seeking the PDH credit, I know that there's a link you can go, and there was a gentleman who was seeking at the back of the room. You can identify yourself and ensure you get the credit that you will earn for this session. These are learning objectives today, that you understand the limitation on subcontracting rules, both the old and the new, because we understand that some folks may have contracts where the previous rules are in effect, and we don't want to neglect you simply because new rules have been put into effect does not erase the old rules that will govern in your existing contracts. To be able to apply the similarly situated entity rule and to use it strategically, to prepare joint venture agreements, and teaming agreements to your strategic advantage and to apply lessons learned from the trenches, to learn from other people's mistakes rather than make them your own. I will turn the clicker over to Rod Hagan, who will lead you through the old school and new school rules.
Thank you. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
After lunch session, the day after Halloween, talk about your snooze fest, right? My job to keep you awake. So for the first 5 hours, we're going to go over the overall limitations. 5 minutes, okay, gotcha. You're awake, see, it works. We're going to go over the limitations of subcontracting, the old rules. I'm going to pace, I'm going to be here. You people that I'm in your way, sorry, yell at me. It's annoying. Set this to the side just a little bit. So the old rules, let's talk first about why are there limitations on subcontracting. Any definition that you're used to that you can come up with is absolutely correct. You can just, as quick as we don't want to have a front business for a large business, to we the government want to make sure that our dollars get the socioeconomic category that's our target for those dollars. Any definition I come up that you can come up with for a reason why is absolutely right. Take it. For the contracting officers mostly, for everybody else that's used to seeing them, here are the FAR clauses today for the various socioeconomic class of small business set-asides. They are intended to be mutually exclusive. One of these should apply to your contract. Government contractors, I can speak, I know the Air Force gets this wrong, sorry for the Air Force. I imagine the others do too, because there's an automated system for doing contracts. For 219.14 reads that it applies to small business and blah, blah, blah. They read that and they apply to all small business. The intent was to apply to total small business set-asides. So one of these apply to you. When you go through that, you see what generalized, what these limitations are. And I think if you're here for a reason, you probably know these. 50% for services, supplies, 15% for general construction, 25% for trade construction. Take all pictures you want. So the variations on that, so it's already in the regulations, if you will, for service civil veteran-owned small businesses, that they can satisfy that rule. What is going to be in the new rule, the similarly situated entity rule, they can satisfy the requirement with other service disabled veteran-owned small businesses. For hub zones, there's a requirement for at least 50% of the cost of the contract be to other hub zone small businesses or themselves. This is particularly restrictive for construction contracting because it means even that 15% requirement, it's a 50% hub zone requirement even for a general construction contract. So this was a particularly restrictive rule that probably wasn't intended to be that way. So the accounting of why this is going to take 5 minutes and why this was supposed to be 3 hours of session here is the old CFR definition, 13 CFR definition of cost of contract incurred for personnel is that labor costs, the labor portion of your overhead, and your G&A. The bad news is when the SBA has changed their rules, they haven't changed the FAR clauses yet. The SBA has changed its rules. This definition is no longer there. In the old school, this was the definition of those things that are still in the FAR today. So, know your accounting, right? They don't provide any guidance on how to do this. Even the protest decisions and things like that don't have any answers for you on how to do this. So right here goes. This is my take on this. I'm not an accountant. I'm not a lawyer. I'm an engineer, and my take on interpreting this. So, it is, yeah, you can tell I'm an engineer, right? So, it's the prime contract's labor divided by the subcontract and the prime contract's labor. That gives you a percentage, right? Easy enough. But you're going to have to add to that a factor that covers the labor portion of the overhead and the G&A that they talked about. Easy enough. There it is. I'm trying to move on to the subject, but I got to get through this. So, bear with me just a little bit. There's another factor once you get to that. You got to realize that then the labor portion of the G&A and the overhead also applies to the subcontractor's G&A and their overhead. So you got to put that factor in there too. So there it is. I'll read it out loud. There's your percentage right there. Prime direct labor plus labor portion of prime overhead plus G&A plus labor portion of prime overhead G&A total subcontract labor cost divided by all of that plus the subcontract direct labor plus subcontract labor portion of overhead plus subcontract G&A. How's that?
So we can download your slides, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
How's that? Anybody wants a sound effect? It goes like this. Right? There's a couple of key takeaways for that, though. One, forget that this is just my opinion. There's no profit in that calculation. It doesn't apply. And of all the things I want to point out is this last one right here. If you satisfy it with your direct labor rate, prime and sub, particularly easy if you're talking construction, you have certified payrolls. You satisfy it with your direct labor rate to the engineers in the room. That number is between 0 and 1. Everything else just adds the same number to the numerator and denominator. It just makes it bigger. Right? So unless there's a big disparity between your overhead and G&A rates between you and your subs, if you satisfy it on direct labor, you're only going to satisfy it by a little more if you get through all the painful calculations. So you shouldn't have to go through that at all. Now, we've got some new rules. 2013 NDAA came out and they said, we're going to base it on contract value, and we have this new thing we call similarly situated entity. In 2016, the SBA finally put that into their rules, and it works right now. Let's see if I get that. There are far changes that are coming. Last time I checked was Friday night. As of Friday night, they haven't officially gone through yet. It's going to come out for comment period. Pointing out that it was a draft rule, which means it would have been implemented very quickly. They decided to change it from a draft rule to actually put it out for review again, even though it's been out long enough. So it's coming soon, but it hasn't happened yet. And that will put them back more into line, the SBA rules, the FAR clauses, and everything else to be in line. So what does the new one say? The new one says basically the same thing, but instead of saying it's 50%, and you have to perform 25%, you have to perform 15%, you have to perform depending on what you're doing. It says how much you can subcontract, 50 or 75 or 85. So is it really much different? I mean, the numbers are really the same. It's just the interpretation of it and how it's written. Services and supplies. The next code that applies to the contract, this is particularly important for the contracting officer here, is whatever is the most value of that contract. Pick one. It's for services or it's for supplies. Might have both. And then the limitations on subcontracting only applies to that portion of the contract.
So let me back up here because I often get confused easily. So if I have a contract that's blended, I have to do this calculation, split the contract and do the calculation to ensure that each element satisfies the calculation.
A contract blended between supplies
and services?
No.
Okay.
So it will come out under the NAICS code of whichever one of those has the higher dollar value.
Within the same contract?
Yes.
Okay.
So if it comes out under the services NAICS code, only the services portion of the contract has limitations on subcontracting.
So you're then free to do whatever you want to do with the other to make margin?
That is correct.
Okie dokie.
So you could easily subcontract more than 50% of the total value of the contract if you're subcontracting 50% of the services, because that's the majority of the contract, and the supplies are also subcontracted.
Okay.
Rod, this was a point I was going to make during my session, but it's a great question, and I'll make it now, is that if you have a question about a solicitation and the NAICS code it's issued under, or on the limitation of subcontracting clause that's used in the solicitation, raise it before you submit your proposal.
Okay.
Because if you wait until after the award, you're going to waive that potential protest ground.
Okay.
So ask the question, submit an informal protest, or submit a pre-bid protest if you don't like the direction it's heading. If you believe that it's a services contract or it's a supplies contract and they've issued it under a NAICS code that isn't, to your advantage, raise that issue as early as possible.
Okay. Thank you.
So the definition in the new CFR of what a similar situated entity is a subcontractor that has the same small business program status as the prime contractor. Now it's missing a little bit. It should go on and say, as the solicitation or contract in question, right? So if Robert here has a affiliated with woman-owned small business, service-disabled veteran-owned small business, has a contract, and it's a service-disabled veteran-owned set-aside, the similarly situated entity is John's company, that's a service-disabled veteran-owned small business. It doesn't have to be a woman-owned small business too, because this is a service-disabled veteran-owned solicitation contract, whatever it's doing. So none of these have to have the same 2 or 3. Which one applies to this contract? Only the first tier subcontractors are important. So, Robert, and then let's get back to the reason. The reason for the similarly situated entity rule. So Chris is a government contracting officer, has $1 million. My target for my socioeconomic benefit is to a service disabled veteran-owned small business. Robert is the recipient of that contract. If Robert subs to John, John is also a service disabled veteran-owned small business. From Chris's perspective, his dollars are still reaching their target. So John, he's not concerned, Chris is not concerned, sorry, didn't mix the names. Chris is not concerned that Robert and John, what portion of the contract they had, because he's still reaching his target. That's what the similarly situated entity rule is.
If John subs out, it doesn't matter?
Correct. That's what I
not, so all his stuff counts. He's subbing out 80%.
No. So I think that's your question too, isn't it?
No, John was a small business and it's a small business set-aside contract.
Okay.
Subs to a woman-owned small business.
Yeah.
They similarly situated.
Yes, if it's a total small business set-aside, so they can, they're both satisfied that requirement. But the question that Chris has was the next point I was going to make. So Robert subbed to John, and that was fine. John subs to Jennifer, who is another service disabled veteran-owned small business. Hers doesn't count. And I know you can say those dollars are reaching their target, but the government doesn't want to be in the business of digging more than one contractor deep to figure out what's going on. So, irrespective of who John's subcontractors are, they don't count. I say they don't count. They're not a part of the service disabled veteran-owned portion of the performed work with limitations of subcontract. Let's make sure I didn't miss anything here. So, one other thing that's important, similarly situated entities, there's a bad word out there called affiliation. Contractors bidding on a contract, depending on the portion of work they do, can be deemed affiliated. They're not exempt from affiliation, but they are exempt from affiliation under the ostensible subcontractor rule. A whole other class on what an ostensible subcontractor is. But under that one caveat of affiliation, they have an exemption. The danger is if they have other reasons, if Robert is subcontracting to John, but Robert happens to be the vice president of John's company, and John happens to be the vice president of Robert's company, and there's some other things going on there, they may be deemed affiliated for other reasons. So here's the importance of the NAICS code, something I said on the last slide. When you have this, you're the prime contractor. Identify the NAICS code of your subcontracts, in your subcontracts. And the example that they used in the regulation, SBA regulation that they changed was architects and engineers. A room full of architects and engineers. How many engineers in the room? Raise your hand. Great. Day after Halloween is jack-o'-lantern smashing day. The ratio of the circumference to the diameter of a jack-o'-lantern, anybody? Pumpkin pie. They don't get better. But if an architect has a contract under their NAICS code, their size standard is $7.5 million. They subcontract to an engineering firm for the engineering. They put the NAICS code in that contract. The NAICS code of the subcontract defines whether or not that engineering firm is the small business, not the NAICS code of the prime contract. This is kind of new. So, you get that? So even if, there's some hesitation. You're not the only one. There's some hesitation there. It's architectural services contract has a $7.5 million size standard to it. $7.5. But their subcontract can subcontract to a small business engineering. To identify that NAICS code in the contract, they can justify basically small business as defined by the SBA for that NAICS code. So they use specifically the architect engineering one in the code as an example. I put some other ones up here that might even apply to those. So they might. Environmental consulting services, I mean, the same thing, might fall under architect engineering contract at that size standard.
Can I ask the question a little bit different?
Okay.
General contractor, 35 or 37.5 million.
Right.
Okay. The mechanical, which is, they've got a specialty trade, whatever, the 17 million.
Right.
The NAICS code of the solicitations is what happens. So if this mechanical has got a $22 million average, he's still under the 37.5, so he's considered small.
You're right. You're putting the negative results of what they're saying in this is correct. He is not considered small under the new rules because he needs to be smaller than the NAICS code for the purpose of he or she. So all pay for good intentions, right?
Currently applicable, or is something to?
This is currently applicable, maybe you can address that a little bit. It's currently applicable as in the SBA regulations. If we have some contracting officers, we're going to go with the parts clauses, they're not caught up with this. So it's one of those gray spaces right now. So I think the contracting officers need to make sure to make this clear now in the solicitation. Where are you going to go with this? You want to add anything to that?
Yeah, there's some great recent protest decisions where protesters have argued that SBA regulations, SBA policy should dictate what should control for what should be in the solicitation. And what GAO has said, what the Court of Federal Claims have said, is that's all well and fine, but it's what in the solicitation, it's what in the, it was what is in the contract. That is what the offerors have agreed to comply with when they submitted their offer or when they received award of the contract. So if you're going to make those arguments, if you're going to try to ensure that these terms are what are the rules of the game you're going to play by, you need to force the issue on the front end. You can't say, well, wait a minute, this is the regulation, this is what you should hold us to, or this is what you should measure us by, contracting officer. You can't do it retroactively. You're going to have to educate the contracting community on the front end and do that by saying, hey, wait a minute, you issued a solicitation that doesn't have the current regulation in it, or that's not in accordance with SBA's policies or that the direction that it's been given. Because when you take it to the tribunals that will decide, they are not going to look at the guidance. They're not going to look at the regulations that could have been incorporated. They're going to look at what has been issued as far as the solicitation or the contract.
So Brad Michael just came in, they're going to sing the next verse. Sorry, I have fun with that. So I put an example right here, and I'm probably not going to take the time to go through the detail, but what I'm trying to demonstrate here is a couple of things. One, again, so there's a supply piece of the contract, and there's a services piece of the contract. So the supply piece of the contract would be the only piece that the limitation applies to. Now, the other thing is, if you have a waiver, if you have a class waiver of something you're buying because it is not provided by a small business, it's only manufactured, if you will, by large businesses, that also is exempt from the calculation of the limitation of the subcontract. Keep that in mind, adding entries here. So, in the regulations, down in the SBA regulations, the potential for fines, if you will, and if you see it's pretty hefty because it's the greater of, not the lesser of, it's the greater, so it's at least $500,000 if somebody do, and I'm going to go to the extent of, fill in the blank here, Carl, if you will, willfully not satisfying limitation on subcontract. Here's some key takeaways I have for people in the room, and I know there's a wide variety of people in the room. So, for the contracting officers, do your market research. Where there are potential class waivers, make sure you get them and you put them in the contract that they apply. Select your NAICS code on the services or the supplies, not both. One, whichever one's a greater value. For the contractors out there, I hate to say contracting officers don't always do their job, because that's not the case. Like in the room, they do their job. But they sometimes miss the reality that some things that you're ordering are not available. And you need to request this class waiver, whether it's specific to this one or should have general class waiver. Limitations on subcontracting applies to the NAICS code, to the primary purpose of the contract. I'm saying the NAICS code is not really that. Services or supplies. One or the other. Doesn't apply to the other. Subcontracting amounts that serve to a similarly situated entity don't count as subcontracted to the first tier level. And then include your NAICS codes on your subcontracts. Those are the key takeaways of the limitation of subcontracting. Is it through that fast enough? All right, I'm moving on.
Thanks, Rob. equals 1 plus 1 can equal 3, and the photo up there, I know it's a little fuzzy, that's actually me. And the point being that I was an English major when I was in college, and somehow ended up liberating Soviet-made military helicopter in Basra. And how that can happen is only if you can add an English major to an ROTC scholarship and some passing knowledge of cloud formation and turbine engine mechanics into a combat military aviator. So if that can happen, then you can actually get a lot more from adding 1 plus 1, and you can equal much more than 2 with joint ventures in government contracting. But only if you dot every I and cross every T. Now, so you think you can joint venture. And all you need is a template. Just, Carl, give me a template and we're ready to go. Well, not so fast. You got to check the regs. Which regs? All the ones that apply. Now, we typically present on joint ventures for an entire hour. And I'm sorry if you guys were here to get the, the detailed, class on joint ventures. We're not going to have the time to cover that. These are the regulations that cover all the different flavors, if you will, of the joint ventures for set-aside categories 8A, the mentor-protege all-small, SDVOSB, hub zone, WOSB, and the EDWOSB. New regulations just came out for eligibility requirements for SDVOSB on October 1st, 2018, issued by the VA to make them fall in line with the eligibility requirements for the SBA. So a lot to digest, a lot to look at if you're looking to get verified as an SDVOSB, and that's going to affect your joint ventures that you want to get verified under the CVE to participate as a SDVOSB joint venture. But these requirements for a joint venture, and all of them, require you to follow the limitations in subcontracting. Okay? And that is where you get some of your joint venture landmines. And you want to know where they are, you want to map your landmines. Okay, so in 13 CFR 121.103H, joint venture agreements have to be in writing, and have to separately identify the JV and SAM. And all of the requirements to get in SAM, you got to have a Bradstreet number, tax ID number, and all the other accoutrements that go along with that. The all-small protege program requires a written joint venture agreement. It has to meet the requirements of 125.8. Okay, now, Rod did a lot of math. I do more word problems than numbers as an English major. So 125.8 tells you the work done by the small business partner in the joint venture must equal no less than 40% of the work done by the joint venture. Well, what's the work done by the joint venture? The work done by the joint venture is the work done by the small business partner plus the work done by the mentor. That seems simple. But the work done by the mentors is the mentor's work plus the mentor's sub's work. And I put in, no doubt. Well, this is kind of where it gets a little squirrely, because there's a requirement that, whoops, I don't want to get to that just yet. There's a requirement that the more that the mentor's work, and if the mentor is not a SDVOSB, or if it's not a small business, the more work that the mentor subs work do, the more the mentor's work is covering, the less work is going to be available for the small business to do. So it's really fun with numbers. And you are making a certification, you are certifying that you are going to comply with the joint venture agreement requirements and with the percentage of work required under the limitation for subcontracting. And anytime you guys hear the word certification, I just want you to think a one word association. Anyone know the word I'm thinking of? Certification equals? Anyone?
Money.
Money, that's good. Another one? Starts with P? Prison. Yes. You are making a representation. You are certifying. You are representing that what you are doing is knowingly telling the truth, which puts you at risk of making a false statement or a false certification or a false representation, which puts you in the land of the False Claims Act. Okay, as I mentioned before, on October 1st, the regulations affecting eligibility for SDVOSB verification went into effect, and eligibility for SDVOSB is going to affect eligibility of the joint ventures looking to secure that status. I'm a lawyer by training, a lawyer by trade, so we throw up case names. Why do we do this? No one talks like this. But I put those up there because they contain some interesting points. Those are not like Brown versus Board of Education. They're not going to have legs, but they're just interesting if you want to go read them. The points they really stand for are, I'll tell you this kind of just quickly. In that CR divided by ZWS or slash ZWS, that was a joint venture. And they had their contract taken away from them after their joint venture agreement had been approved by the SBA. And the reason they had gotten it taken away was after they had been approved by the SBA, they had gotten protested. And there was a requirement in the joint venture agreement to talk about what resources each joint venture partner was bringing to the party. And when they looked at those resources, they said, whoa, the larger company is bringing the vast majority of the resources and the capability. And the smaller company isn't bringing very much of anything besides its status and the administration. And the company, I believe it was CR, was a smaller company, was saying, well, that's the whole purpose. We are an 8A. We are looking to gain experience. This is our second mentor-protege relationship. We are looking to create a second line of business. And the SBA said, well, you got to do more than just be looking. You have to have some experience, some relation. You have to bring more than just your home office and more than just, a desire. And they said, well, wait a minute, this sounds like you're saying we're unusually reliant on our large business partner. This sounds like an ostensible subcontractor analysis. And under the mentor-protege joint venture regulation, we're supposed to be protected from this kind of analysis, this kind of affiliation. And the Court of Federal Claims said, no, this is not an ostensible subcontractor analysis. This is really a test of the integrity of allowing you to form this kind of joint venture under this mentor-protege to see if you would actually benefit from this kind of relationship. What benefit would the 8A company get if they have no base on which to build. So, I bring that up because the question here with regard to limitation on subcontracting is, how would they be able to manage any subcontractors who would be outside of their experience? The question would be, they couldn't. They don't know the area, they don't know the industry. They would be hiring subcontractors that they would be further reliant on, because they would have relationships with a large mentor, that they would be relying on their mentor, and then on their subs, they would just be along for the ride. So that's why I included that for your reading pleasure. I bring up the FAR 9.104 and the decision regarding Rule of Two. That all kind of goes back to Kingdomware, which I'm sure many of you guys have heard of. The Kingdomware in Rule of Two goes to the issue of the government's requirement to determine if it's going to receive reasonable offers. Will it receive 2 or more reasonable offers to perform the work from SDVOSBs, okay, for VA contracts? It doesn't have to determine at that time if those companies will be responsible. So it doesn't have to do an analysis with regard to limitations on subcontracting. So folks could submit and say, oh, they're looking for sources sought. We have the right NAICS code. We could submit. Our plan will be we're going to subcontract the majority of the work, and we can get, on the list of capable folks. A number of companies have done that, and they have gotten past that first test. They have secured the designation as an SDVOSB set-aside contract, and other folks have protested saying, wait a minute, these people can't do it. They're going to have to subcontract the majority of this work. And what GAO and the Court of Federal Claims have said is that's a responsibility determination. That's not a Rule of Two Kingdomware determination. It may end up that you may have a good grounds to protest down the road, or it may turn out that the contracting officer has to say there's no one to award the contract to. But as far as the designation for setting this up as a set-aside, they are good to go. So as you are looking at and responding to sources sought, keep in mind that the stronger you can make your responses, and in an eye to setting up your teams, you want to arm those agencies with information about what the market actually is. Contracting officers are administrators of the procurement system. They are not armed to be investigators. They have to conduct a reasonable investigation of the market, but they are looking to the market to inform them. They don't have to be forensic, conduct a forensic analysis. You have to provide them the information. Okay, so we've talked about the landmines. How do you convert them to gold mines? Well, as you're negotiating your JV agreements, you want to coordinate. You want to work together to identify how it is that you are going to actually perform the work. And there are a number of guidelines for what your JV agreements should say, and a lot of LegalZoom and other sources for documents you can use for operating agreements, and they are great starting points. But my take on templates is I want you to contemplate templates. That's not to say that I am completely against them, but you really need to think about them more as starting points than end points, okay? And you should openly communicate about the documents that you're using and look at them not as something that you have to just get through and sign in the last minute to submit for approval, but look at them as tools you're going to use for your project. And again, collaborate and really think about, particularly on projects that involve services, think about the labor, where the labor comes from, who controls the labor, and who's going to supervise and who's going to manage the labor. Okay? There are decisions out there that talk about, particularly with using labor forces from the incumbent and the supervisory personnel from the incumbent, that can result in problems for the awardee. But here, with regard to the limitations on subcontracting, we talk about trying to borrow, lease, or hire employees from your joint venture member to try to make that work as far as what portion of the work is being done by whom or from whose subcontractor. That can all be done, but you got to lay that out on the front end in your joint venture agreement, and not just vaguely like we're going to comply with the regulation, but map out how you intend to do that so it's transparent that that is what your plan is. It's got to be a continuous consideration. There was recently issued by the GAO a report, I think it was October 24th, and they did a study on the Vets First contract and its oversight of its review, of its monitoring of the limitations on subcontracting. And what it found was that of the about 100 or so contracts that it reviewed, 25% of the contracts were not compliant in some material way with the limitations on some subcontracting requirements. Now, that could have been that the contract or solicitation documents itself didn't have the proper clause in it, or that the contractors were not compliant with the requirements if it did have the right clause in it. So 25%. Now, in 2017, I believe they reported that there were about, I think it was $4 billion in set-aside contracts awarded. And so 25% of that not compliant with this requirement, that's substantial. And that's substantial from a standpoint of folks at risk for having the hammer brought down on them. That is substantial risk from the standpoint of people subjected to protests. Now it's also been identified in a GAO report, so there are recommendations made to the VA for the Vets First program for steps they should take to correct that. So you can imagine that there are going to likely be corrective actions implemented to reduce that number of instances of non-compliance. Yes, sir.
Yes, I was at a conference last week with another law firm, and they had decided something similar, and they said that the SBA is now going to target more audits, more SBD, set-aside contracts for that specific reason. So to expect for all SBDs, to expect surprise audits by the SBA, and they're going to come down like the VA or set-aside choice. This year is going to be SBDs. Is that correct?
Every indication that I've had has been that that's a reasonable expectation. I mean, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for them to announce when they're going to do surprise audits, but that would make a lot of sense, and it would follow because what the GAO has done is they have treated SBA and VA with the set-aside programs similarly, but as offset. So they have led with 8A, and then they have followed up 8A, then WOSB, and Veteran Set Aside and Hub Zone, and they have kind of just like worked those, around. Yeah.
In other words, because of that 25%.
Yes.
So what does that mean to you? What's the type of, is it going to be just a flat number? I mean, how do you kind of go with the process that they look at in terms of identify those type of companies?
Well, again, I think it's going to fall down to the action level, which is going to be at the contracting officer and the core level. And what's first going to be is they're going to be told to identify what are the red flags, right? So that's going to start with, what's the proposal. But they're also probably going to put for people to tell on themselves. Make a requirement that you now need, as a contractor, you have to give us a monthly report of your compliance with how are you meeting this goal of meeting your limitation of subcontracting requirements,
So
right?
in other words, if you had one, if you're doing 25% of your subcontracts, one company, you're not looking to go to the SBA.
Right. They would ask that you demonstrate how you are compliant. I mean, rather than issuing, show cause notice, they just make it a contract reporting
And that's
requirement.
where, when they come in, it's like understanding the consequences of that, and then when they start, once they see something, then they start drilling down, and that's the bottom of the first time.
Well, that's not the ultimate, right? That it's 500 or more.
500,000 plus.
It's the minimum.
The minimum is 500,000, and then they can penalize you because you were not in compliance. Basically, you were a subcontractor, you would say you were doing 30% to one company. And they can go back and say, well, you were a gross violation, we're going to slap you with $1 million fine, but you and the other owner with $1 million fine. So in other words,
Right, or they can demonstrate that it wasn't willful, right? That you had a plan in place, and that for whatever reason in that month, it happened to go over the line one way rather than the other, and you've taken steps you caught it as the contractor. You've already taken steps to correct it, right? And that the work in place now with the next distribution of the pay will demonstrate a correction.
I wanted to ask you another question. By the way, is there a sunset clause on this? When the SBA is now with this, what I mean by that is, let's say you had a contract you're going to do here, JV, is it like that JV runs out and then the new clause will start, or does it start as the middle of that JV and have to go back?
As far as I know, they did not put in any sunset provision in the new eligibility. That's an interesting question. It's one I've asked myself, because
How can you go back and redo everything when you're in contract with the government and you're already
what I have advised my clients is that they do an amendment to their operating agreement and to their JV agreement to be compliant with the newest regulations. Yes.
Do the newest regulations have a safe harbor provision?
Not that I saw.
They haven't developed that yet, okay.
So the safe harbor provision would then be augmentation to your
That's what I would, just because people are very creative, and I know that everybody's friends here, but when it comes to trying to win a contract, people will look to protest anything they can, and they're like, oh, wait a minute, they got verified, X years ago based on the public information, so I bet you that they're not complying with the new regulations, so let's challenge them on that ground. And then, you can make the argument that, oh, well, they're not, then they have to argue that our eligibility was decided back then, and that should carry forward, and then it's on us to make the argument that even though there's not a grandfather clause or a sunset provision, that we are compliant, even though on the face of our documents, it doesn't match the eligibility requirements. But the regulation said it's good for 3 years. Yes. Oh, trust me. There are people who make a living, there are lawyers who make a living taking protests that may not work.
If I wanted to go down and look at every JV that happens to be in the next code that I spot that, I can just protest it and ask, I would say these numbers because people wouldn't have a clue about it. They haven't sat in this conference to understand it.
Yes, which is why I wonder why there's so many empty seats.
You're an English major.
Yeah.
Labor services. What about the scenarios where the wholesaler, in our case, will buy now you still have to, you will back it down to the weighted average because it's the way the market works out? Or if you're doing the work that
Yeah, it does get complicated with, as Rod was talking about, with how you would do the math depending on which rule is going to apply. Under the new rule, if it was just and that's the first thing. The first question is, what kind of a contract is this? Is it a supply contract? Is it a services contract? Is it a blended contract? And which part of the blend are you applying? If it's a supply contract, then what you should be looking at is just the cost for the supply, right? And then that portion, and then you say, okay, well then, how much of that are we carving out and subcontracting for the supply? You got to check what you plan, what you anticipate versus what the actual reality is, and then plan for change. Okay, teaming agreements. This is for Ms. Gilmore. I am so sorry, Lanisha. We had planned to give Lanisha the better part of 40 minutes for her session. I'm sorry.
about the work share. And the calculation is combined. Again, when there's specific, how many people here have experience in a prime contract? Good. Very good. So if you're a prime contractor, then you want to think about different things as far as your community than you would if you were a subcontractor. So if you're a prime contractor, you want to retain discretion and be as flexible as possible. So you still want to be specific, but you want to make sure that you have an opportunity to change certain things in that need agreement later on. So you want to retain discretion to define the contract W, committees to make unilateral changes to the sub-work. You want to require approval of the subcontract, and you want to keep the pricing flexible. Now, how many people have experienced subcontracting? So, if you're a sub, you want to be very specific. You want to make sure that your work within that community is very specific. You want to define the work percentage, again, for disposal. You possibly want to have that subcontract as complete as possible, so that once they know that time of work, you're ready to go in, sign, no delay, and get work started. And you also want to be very clear on the pricing technique. Now we're talking about the new rules. Again, going over what Ron said, these are the three main points. The new rules, we want to look at the contract value instead of the work share percentage. And of course, the purposes of the contract is considered situated, and we're going to make sure that you take this appropriate. So the general considerations for the new rule, again, who is your team partner? What are the satisfied considerations? The parties can be situated. Think about the date codes that are assigned to the contract. And you want to make sure you take the calculations based on the contract value. So again, if you were prime, it's pretty similar. You want to retain discretion again, because you want to be able to be flexible on any changes you need, because at the time, your previous contract is actual settlement. Then you have responsibility to settle under the contract. You want to approve the subcontract in a time limit. I usually want to apply it to about 30 to 60 days, 60 days at the most. And then also want to consider pricing flexibility. And then here's the sub. Specifically in prime tax, you want to make sure that the value that you're going to get is very clear and defined. And you want to make sure that the contract, subcontract is part of you. And you want to make sure that you have some past performance experience that makes both. Just going over that. Again, with the sub. So overall, your main goal is your time. You want to secure your team member, retain the flexibility at the time, and your sub, your main goal is to find the value out of the contract value. Finally, the team agreement landmines. So these are just a few contracts, or not contracts, a few cases that kind of define how we look at team agreement today. And the reason why I said define and specify from the time. So if you pay attention to the letters or the words you read, the sidewalk consulting, it says that team agreement without specificity may be unenforceable. So again, the reason why I'm saying don't just use the template to really think about defining the scope of work, defining, the pricing, and attaching that to the contract. If you see the Texas case, no definite terms, there's no agreement. That was the court decided in that case. And the TGI Federal, single subcontractors should negotiate and clear subcontract terms with the team agreement and minimize any conditions to a subcontract. So please take your time when you are preparing for proposals, not just to use templates, but think about these that is all. Most of you guys will, find this morning. And if you have any questions, please feel free to either ask us now, if you have the time. We don't have any time.
That's okay. It's okay. I'm going to throw out the first question. How many contracting officers do we have in the room? Any at all? At least one? Two, I see. Good for you. You have almost all of the authority for policing the limitation of subcontracting responsibility, and you have almost all of the responsibility. You have almost zero authority. And I'm sorry, and the contractors need to realize that. I had a contracting officer send me a letter once demanding proof of compliance on a contract we were about 50% complete with. So, rather than sending back a letter that said, "Dear Pinhead," I sent back a letter that said, I did tell him, you have no authority to ask this, but here's all the information. Here's the answer. Here's where we are now. We were actually less than 50% at that particular moment. Here's our plan. We're going to be complying with it by the completion of this contract. But as the way the regulations are written today, you can't ask that question, or they have no obligation to answer your question if you ask that mid-performance in a contract. What you mentioned that they're going to be auditing, to do that, it's going to have to be an after-the-fact audit of contracts that are complete, not contracts that are in progress, likely. So, just wanted to put that twist on it.
Is there anyone here from Kentucky?
Nobody?
No one from Kentucky? Oh, well, our marketing director, Laura, is from Kentucky. There's a Supreme Court decision from Kentucky, which is a state court case between a prime and a sub on their subcontract agreement, and that had a teaming agreement, which incorporated their explicit agreement to comply with the federal limitation of subcontracting clause, incorporated by reference into their teaming agreement. The sub was suing the prime for additional monies that they thought they were due for extra work on that contract that they believe they were required to perform by the prime. What the Supreme Court in Kentucky said, you might have done the work, but you also agreed that the limitation of the subcontracting clause is going to govern your relationship. So you agreed that you would not perform more work and look for more money that would throw the percentages out of whack. So therefore, you could not have contracted or agreed to perform more work for more pay that would have caused the prime contractor to have violated its contract with the federal government. Therefore, that could not have been your agreement to perform that work for that price.
That's a tough one.
So understand that those agreements, those clauses you incorporate by reference, have effect not just to comply for the sense of complying with the federal, but that going to govern your relationship with your partner, your business partner, for all of your business related to that project.
So I know it's 3 and people have places to be, but if you want to stay and talk with us, stay and talk with us. So
Thank you all.
There he is. Good to see you. I'm glad you guys made it. Oh, did you? I was stuck in my hotel room on the phone. Mom, that's worked out for you. Are you free for dinner tonight? Good. Wonderful. I got my crew and they are, will do. Where are you staying?
I'll work it out.
No, I wasn't worried, I'm just curious.
No,
But I appreciate it, thank you. Wonderful. Great. I'll meet you.
Very nice to meet you.
The similarly situated individual still applies. Oh, right. Yep.
Yeah, and oh, are you, what's this guy doing?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, there are.
So what stuff is yours? Just the everything? Okay.
Thank you.
Here, Mike, do you want some more?
No, thanks. I don't need that much sugar.
Right.
Oh my goodness.
So you have a private time, right? Proposal is part of the contract. You can say, well, your proposal will become part of the contract. Yeah. Yeah, you have the proper payment, proper payment clause in the FAR, which you can withhold from the client until they demonstrate that they have paid their subs.
There's two issues. There's the issue of like they're not getting any, the other issue is the